He vanished without a trace, leaving behind a grieving family and unanswered questions. To the world, he was a tragic victim lost too soon. But behind the facade of tears and condolences lay a secret. A man who had meticulously planned his own disappearance to escape the life he no longer wanted. The morning started like any other, with the faint hum of routine buzzing through the house. He sat at the breakfast table, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down like an invisible shroud. Bills piled up on the counter, each envelope an unrelenting reminder of the life he had built but no longer wanted. His wife moved around the kitchen, her cheerful chatter cutting through the heavy silence he carried inside. The kids squabbled over cereal, their voices a chaotic symphony he barely registered anymore. To anyone looking in, it was a picture-perfect family. But to him, it felt like a trap. He had thought about it for months, maybe even years, though he couldn't pinpoint when the idea first lodged itself in his mind. At first, it was just a fleeting fantasy, a what-if that he entertained during moments of frustration. But slowly, it grew roots, transforming into a plan. His plan. He didn't want to hurt them, not really. He loved his family, in his own way. But the pressure to be the provider, the fixer, the man who had it all together was suffocating. It wasn't enough anymore. Not for him. That morning, as he kissed his wife on the cheek and waved goodbye to his children, he felt a pang of guilt. This might be the last time he would see them. But the guilt was quickly replaced by a strange sense of liberation. He had made his decision. It was the only way out that made sense to him. He drove to the lake a few towns over, a secluded spot he had scouted weeks earlier. The water was still and dark, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. He parked the car, leaving the keys in the ignition, and walked to the edge. A carefully chosen assortment of personal items was left behind. His wallet, his watch, a note scribbled with vague apologies but no real explanations. He wanted it to look believable, tragic even, but not overly dramatic. Just enough to make people stop asking questions. He waded into the water, feeling the chill rise around him. Then, with one last look at the life he was leaving behind, he vanished into the shadows, disappearing not into death, but into a new life waiting beyond the horizon. The first few days were the hardest. He had rehearsed the plan in his head so many times, convinced that once he was free, relief would wash over him. Instead, he found himself haunted by a strange mixture of guilt and exhilaration. He stayed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of a town where no one would think to look for him. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, the wallpaper peeling at the edges. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had ditched his car a few miles from the lake, knowing it would soon be found. A bus ticket purchased under a fake name took him farther away from his old life. He carried only a backpack stuffed with essentials, a change of clothes, a burner phone, and the cash he'd been quietly siphoning from joint accounts for months. He had thought of every detail, every potential slip-up, but even the best-laid plans couldn't prepare him for the weight of silence. The news came quicker than he expected. Sitting in a greasy diner, he saw his face flash across the small TV mounted in the corner. The local station reported his disappearance with somber tones, showing pictures of his family holding back tears. His wife's voice cracked as she pleaded for any information. His eldest child stood beside her, visibly shaken. He had expected this, but seeing it was different. He told himself it was better this way, that they would be better off without him. It was a lie he clung to like a lifeline. Every knock at the motel door sent a jolt of panic through him. He stayed off the grid as much as possible, avoiding places that required an ID or a paper trail. He spent his days wandering through unfamiliar streets, his mind a battleground between regret and resolve. He kept telling himself this was freedom, but freedom felt eerily like loneliness. One night, he sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to call, to hear their voices just one more time. But he couldn't. He had chosen this path, and turning back wasn't an option. With a heavy sigh, he turned off the light, letting the darkness engulf him as he lay awake, wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Weeks turned into months, and he began to settle into his new life, though settle might have been too generous a word. His days were a monotonous blur, spent working odd jobs that paid under the table. He avoided small talk, gave no personal details, and used the name Mark, a simple alias that he had grown used to hearing. Each town was just a stopgap, a temporary haven until the walls of paranoia closed in and he moved on again. He had shaved his beard and dyed his hair a dull brown. The changes were subtle, but enough to avoid recognition. He avoided mirrors when he could. The man staring back looked foreign, a stranger who had stolen his own life. Sometimes he wondered if anyone from his old life would even recognize him now. It was easier to pretend they wouldn't. In one particularly sleepy town, he found work at a rundown gas station. It was the kind of place where the smell of motor oil clung to the air and the radio crackled with old rock ballads. He liked the quiet. The owner, an older man named Hank, didn't ask too many questions, and for that, he was grateful. The routine was mindless, stocking shelves, ringing up customers, cleaning up spills. At night, he sat on the back steps of the station, staring at the stars and wondering if his family ever looked up at the same sky, thinking of him. The money he had stashed away was running low. Living off cash-only jobs was harder than he had anticipated. The reality of his new existence was far less romantic than he had imagined. He wasn't living free. He was merely surviving. The dreams of adventure, of a life unburdened by responsibility, had eroded into a daily grind even more isolating than the one he'd escaped. One afternoon, a customer walked in, a woman with sharp eyes and a curious demeanor. She paused, staring at him just a beat too long. His heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral. Had she recognized him? Or was his paranoia getting the best of him again? As she left, her gaze lingered, a ghost of a smile on her lips, as though she knew a secret. The encounter left him rattled, a stark reminder that no matter how far he ran, the past had a way of catching up. The encounter at the gas station lingered in his mind, festering like an open wound. He replayed the woman's expression over and over, dissecting every glance, every flicker of recognition that might have passed across her face. He told himself it was nothing, a coincidence, a product of his fraying nerves, but the doubt refused to be silenced. For days, he kept looking over his shoulder, scanning every customer, every shadow, for signs that someone might be watching. The paranoia pushed him to move again. He packed his meager belongings, leaving a hastily scribbled note for Hank, thanking him for the job. By dawn, he was on a bus headed for a town even more obscure, a place where he could once again disappear into anonymity. The cycle was becoming familiar. Arrive, settle, retreat. Each new start felt more futile than the last, but he didn't know how to stop. Going back wasn't an option, and staying in one place felt like courting disaster. The new town was a dusty, sun-bleached speck on the map, with a population small enough that he could blend in without drawing attention. He found work in a scrapyard, hauling rusted metal and sorting through piles of discarded machinery. It was grueling, thankless labor, but it paid enough to keep him afloat. The other workers barely spoke to him, which suited him fine. He was just another nameless drifter to them, and that was exactly what he wanted. Yet, even in this remote corner of nowhere, his past found ways to haunt him. One evening, while scrolling through local news on an old borrowed laptop, he came across an article about his disappearance. It wasn't the first time he'd seen coverage about himself, but this was different. The piece was about his family, a profile of their resilience in the face of tragedy. There was a photo of his wife and children, smiling bravely for the camera. His youngest had grown taller, almost unrecognizable. His wife's eyes, though, betrayed the toll his absence had taken. The guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. He slammed the laptop shut, his hands trembling. For all his efforts to escape, he couldn't outrun the ghost of the man he used to be. That night, as he lay awake in the tiny room he rented above a bar, he wondered if his attempt to find freedom had only shackled him to a different kind of prison. The days blurred together in the scrapyard, a symphony of clanging metal and the acrid smell of rust. He threw himself into the work, hoping the physical exhaustion would drown out the thoughts that gnawed at him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape them. His family's faces haunted him at night, appearing in his dreams with the same clarity as if they were in the room beside him. He could hear their voices, their laughter, and sometimes their tears. It was unbearable. One afternoon, while sorting through a heap of discarded belongings, he found a battered photo album among the debris. Curious, he opened it, flipping through faded pictures of a family he didn't know. Birthdays, vacations, quiet moments frozen in time. He felt an ache in his chest, a hollow reminder of what he had left behind. That night, he sat in his room staring at the burner phone he had avoided using for months. His hands shook as he dialed a number he could never forget. He didn't press call. Instead, he smashed the phone against the wall in frustration, shards scattering across the floor. He had gone too far to turn back now, or so he told himself. But something was shifting inside him. The idea that he could leave it all behind, start over, and find happiness had proven to be a cruel lie. He wasn't free. He was trapped in a life of isolation, haunted by the shadows of those he had abandoned. A week later, the decision came to him suddenly, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. He packed his bag one last time and bought a bus ticket, not to another obscure town, but back to the city he had fled from. The journey felt like walking into the jaws of a beast, but he knew it was the only way to silence the torment within him. When he arrived, it was late evening, the streets quiet under the dim glow of streetlights. He stood outside the house he used to call home, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might wake the neighborhood. Through the window, he saw his family gathered in the living room. His wife was reading to their youngest, her voice soft and comforting. His eldest was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through a phone. They looked peaceful, and for a moment, he wondered if they were better off without him. But then his youngest glanced at the window, catching sight of the man standing in the shadows. Their eyes met, and recognition dawned like a spark catching fire. The child jumped up, shouting, "Dad!" The front door flew open, and suddenly they were all there. His wife, his children, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and overwhelming relief. He dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It wasn't the reunion he had imagined, and forgiveness wouldn't come easily. But in that moment, surrounded by the family he had almost lost forever, he knew one thing. He was done running.